was 3 years old when the Second World War broke out, and too young to have vivid memories of the arrival of the German occupying forces in Guernsey at the end of June 1940. Earlier that month, with news of a probable German occupation, my parents made a decision to leave the island and join my father's brother and his family living in London. I was preschool age and too young to be included in the 5,000 children evacuated with their schools to the mainland. We missed what turned out to be the last boat. German aircraft machine-gunned and bombed the harbours of St. Peter Port and St. Helier on the 28th of June 1940, indiscriminately killing 44 innocent civilian islanders and injuring many more. 34 died in Guernsey. The pilots believed that lorries loaded with boxes of tomatoes were carrying ammunition waiting to be loaded on the mail boat alongside, so many friends and relatives were lost. The first German planes landed at Guernsey Airport on the 30th of June, and so began the 5 years of loss of freedom and hardship. I got used to the sound of marching boots across the top of the lane where we lived, accompanied by German voices bellowing out German songs. Our bungalow was a very short distance from the batteries Strasbourg at Cherbourg, a barracks on an important high point on the island, where huge guns with tremendously powerful sights kept guard over the neighbouring islands and the distant coast of France. After liberation on the 9th of May, my mother and father took me to explore the deserted bunkers, where we found maps and general paperwork hurriedly left and strewn over surfaces. Everywhere. We peered through the gun sights aimed at St. Peter Port Harbour, and incredibly we could recognise people walking around the quay. My English grandmother, mother and aunt were married to Guernsey men and so took their domicile, which was a blessing when Hitler gave an order to deport all British residents to camps in Germany. I did not understand why so many people were being taken away until I heard the horrified discussions between my family and friends. It was in retaliation to something the British had carried on German prisoners. Neither did I understand the loss of freedom, the curfews and the strict regulations. I was not afraid, as it was a way of life and I was used to seeing Germans everywhere. There were thousands of them, so many living amongst us or around us. I made sure whenever I saw a German uniform I kept well clear. I did nothing to provoke them, unlike some of the older children in the town who sometimes played tricks and ran away. Nor did I understand why there were so many bedraggled, starving slave labourers marching along the roads, their clothes in tatters. On arrival, the German army began to take possession of islanders' homes with little or no warning, or commandeered rooms and moved in with householders, as they did with some of our family and friends, and eventually with us. The elite of the command moved into hotels. It was during a latter part of the occupation the German billeting officer took possession of my bedroom, and a German meteorologist moved into our bungalow. In some ways we were fortunate not to be turfed out with only our personal possessions, but it was stressful living with the enemy. He took his main meals at the Battery Strasbourg, but brought food for his breakfast to our house every day. By this time rations were meagre and food was scarce, and he would sometimes leave a small piece of bread and a sliver of butter on the table and say to my mother, "For de kind," for the child. He kept himself to himself, and my parents kept their distance. Avoiding fraternization and living with the enemy was not easy. Many of the soldiers had left their families and children behind in Germany, and it was not unusual for a soldier to look upon some children with kindness. One day as I was riding my bike towards town to visit my grandmother, I heard the drone of an Allied plane. Even at that young age I knew the difference between German and Allied engines. My father had instructed me to hug a wall or hedge against the sound when I heard one, so that any machine gun fire would go over my head. Looking for cover, I had hesitated opposite a row of houses when a German officer threw open one of the front doors, raced across the road, grabbed me and dragged me back inside the house until it was safe to leave. Although the island was heavily occupied, islanders were normally able to go about their daily lives without too much German interference, provided the strict regulations were followed, which was not always the case. My grandfather was a butcher, and my mother would on an odd occasion produce a small piece of meat from out of nowhere. I later discovered that at the request of a farmer, my grandfather had secretly and illegally slaughtered a pig or a cow and received as payment a joint of meat to be shared between our whole family. He had a small trailer attached to the back of his bicycle. He would hide the joint of meat beneath a rug and trust he would not be stopped by a German before he reached the relative safety of home. He never got caught, which was a wonder, but if he had been, he would have immediately been deported and imprisoned. My father was not so lucky. One of our neighbours was arrested for illegally cutting down a tree for firewood. My father waited until the soldiers and our neighbour had marched away, then tried to help by storing some of the logs out of sight. He was discovered by a hidden sentry and arrested too. My mother and I rushed out of the house at the commotion to see my father being marched past our house and up the lane, struggling with a large log of wood across his shoulders. Terrified, we rushed after them, tears running down our faces, and my mother pleading the soldier to stop, but she was flung aside. My father and our neighbour were forced to spend the night at the barracks. Fortunately, D-Day had closed the route to France, and they were released the next day with a heavy fine. Very lucky to have escaped deportation. Early in the occupation, radios were confiscated, and the newspaper was heavily censored. We had secretly obtained a crystal set known as the Cat's Whisker, and it was possible with the use of a purloined set of earphones to tune into Start Point in Devon, from where the BBC broadcast could be picked up in the Channel Islands. It was a source of reliable British news compared to the propaganda the Germans included in the Guernsey newspaper. Popular music and songs were written down and often included in musical performances. Fingers crossed the Germans in the audience would not recognise its origin. We kept our crystal set in a biscuit tin. One day, placing it on a chair and taking it in turns to listen in, with the earphones we heard the front door thrown open. The Germans had no regard for privacy or islanders' rights, and my father quickly threw a cushion on top of the set before a German officer strode into the room. He promptly sat down on the cushion. We were terrified he would lift the cushion because he might feel the lump, but as soon as he had finished speaking he rose and left as quickly as he had arrived. It took quite a bit of time to straighten and repair the set. From the broadcasts received on crystal sets, a news sheet was born. It was called GUNS, Guns, Guernsey Underground News Service. It was typed on tomato packing tissue paper, and the news sheet was set up by 5 islanders and circulated very secretly amongst trustworthy people. Our family was lucky enough to receive a copy. Tragically, the 5 men were betrayed, arrested and deported to Germany, and 2 of the men died. Today, as an adult, I can understand what my parents had to endure. They suffered the fear of reprisal and the lack of food and waiting to be served at shops and stalls, only to be filled with despair when after queuing for an hour or so there was nothing left to buy. My mother returned home on many an occasion in a state of distress. We were a bit better off out of town, as my father could grow a few vegetables, but as the island continued deeper into the occupation and food became much scarcer, the next hurdle was to guard what you had against theft. My father kept an iron pole at the bedside to protect us from any intruders. Germans and civilians alike were hungry, and the weekly rations were diminishing fast. Malnutrition was rife, and people began to die. Cats disappeared, and it was well known that many of the wretched animals were caught, cooked and eaten by the starving Germans. My mother managed to protect Bubbles, our blue Persian cat who survived the occupation, moved with us to London after we were liberated, and attained the grand old age of 15. But for a particular small boat of islanders managing to escape to England and informing the British government of the situation, one cannot imagine the outcome if they had not requested the Red Cross to arrange for food parcels to be sent to the islands. The Red Cross ship, the Vega, arrived in St. Peter Port just after Christmas 1944 and made a further 4 trips monthly and a final one after liberation, totalling 6 in all. These were lifesavers. The Germans were not allowed to take any parcels, but in consequence they cut the civilian rations. Desperate, some of the soldiers endeavoured to steal parcels, and one of my aunts was a victim of one such robbery. My mother hid our allocations behind the panel on the front of our upright piano. Sometimes when she played it, an odd rattle could be heard, but the tins did not stay there long enough to cause much of a problem, although my mother tried to make the contents last as long as possible. Curfew brought many anxieties, as it was not permitted to leave the house until curfew ended the following morning. There were odd occasions when some islanders took a chance, but generally it was not worth the penalty. Families, friends and neighbours shared the deprivation, trying to help each other in any way they could. Bartering and exchanging goods was advertised in shops. Prices of commodities, what little there were, zoomed out of all proportion in the black market. Many of the musicals and entertainment put on by islanders had to be held in the afternoon to accommodate the curfew hours. My parents took part in musicals, and I belonged to a dancing troupe. At the age of 6, I had a solo tap dance routine, animal crackers in my soup. I was nervous going on stage, but not as nervous as my mother, who had spent hours rehearsing me. I enjoyed having makeup applied to my face, and later not so much the goose grease removing it. The show was put on in the Candle Auditorium under canvas and supported by an audience of islanders, which included German soldiers. They liked to attend the shows in the cinemas. The cinemas had partitioning railings installed to separate the soldiers from the public. A party at our house was a special occasion. Guests had to stay the night cramped into our 2-bedroom bungalow, a period before we were invaded by our unwelcome German guest. My father played the violin and the harmonica, and my mother played the piano. Our sitting room was small, but somehow friends and relatives managed to crowd in, determined to enjoy themselves. I still remember my mother had a most pretty party dress. It was a cream-coloured chiffon printed with red poppies. I loved it, and after we were liberated and moved to London, I would borrow it and dress up in it. It was far too big and long for me, but I felt like a princess swirling around in it and trying not to trip over the hem, then hiding it back in the wardrobe before my mother found out. Recycling was a major thing. Nothing was thrown away. I loved unpicking woolen jumpers, winding the wool up, my mother making skeins across my held-out arms, washing it, drying it, and re-knitting it into something else. As I grew older and needed larger clothes, I was thrilled to receive and try on clothes left behind by children who had been evacuated. There were no new clothes to buy in the shops. My mother found a job with a tailor and learnt to mend and repair men's trousers and alter suits to earn a little money. My father was a baker. As supplies became shorter, bread was made with flour containing ground husks, and I could not believe the texture and taste of white bread when we were finally liberated. My father worked at the bakery until after D-Day. It was not possible to obtain flour for 6 weeks. Needing to earn money to keep the family, he had little choice but to find a job at the Batterie Strasbourg, unaccustomed as he was to heavy work, until later he could return to the bakery. Despite all the restrictions, I remember Christmas as a time of laughter and fun. The family gathered in my grandparents' large house, staying overnight, and one of my uncles played Santa Claus. We had lacy paper chains strung across and around the room, and my grandmother's carefully saved Christmas decorations, all dominated by a decorated Christmas tree with a fairy at the top. Celebrations were rare because of the lack of food, but I remember in particular one of my birthdays was a special treat. My father collected a tiny amount of flour and butter from the parents of each child attending the party in order to make a few tiny cakes, but I think this must have been earlier on in the occupation. Transport in general was made by walking or bicycling. As a special treat, arrangements had been made for my friends to arrive by horse and cart. Altogether, an exciting day for all of us. The borders were closed to all civilians, and an exception for essential journeys to Jersey, France, and other specified countries as permitted by the German authorities. Supplies from the UK had been cut off from the beginning of the occupation. A Guernsey man was appointed by the German authorities to travel to France at regular intervals to purchase food and other basic necessities. On each occasion he carried a suitcase filled with Deutschmarks, which had replaced our Guernsey currency. There were so many things I discovered after we were liberated. I was too young to understand that the island was too small for real organised resistance. Reprisals were tough, and it was almost impossible to go into hiding, let alone get off the island. When British planes dropped propaganda leaflets over the island, we children rushed about in excitement, picking them up only to have them confiscated. The V sign appeared often in hidden form, such as a brooch or a part of a design on a flagstone or wall. Overhead wires were cut, bringing a threat of reprisals. Fishermen were allowed to take their boats out to catch fish, provided a German sentry was on board, but the fisherman also had to have a family ashore to ensure he did not try to escape to England. The occupation years were hard and ruthless. Liberation Day on the 9th of May 1945 is a day I will never forget. The excitement, British uniforms, the noise, the hugs, a sea of Union Jacks, the start to an end of 5 miserable years. There is so much more I remember of those devastating years, but that is for another time. Following my parents' decision to finally join my father's brother and his family in London, I had the thrill of travelling on the Cross Channel ferry, the excitement of boarding a steam train, and the magic of travelling on the underground trains. London was the beginning of a brand new adventure. For many of us who lived through the German occupation, the COVID-19 lockdown is somewhat reminiscent in so many ways of those 5 miserable years. The regulations, the curfews, the long queues, loss of freedom, fear of the visible enemy, and now today unseen. I would never have thought I would live to experience 2 such nightmarish ordeals.